I think some people tried to draw the significance that I was burying my past or something like that. People who were mentors and helped me out.
At 95, Clint Eastwood sits in silence beneath a California sunset. A man whose eyes have seen the rise and fall of Hollywood itself. Once the face of American grit and quiet rebellion, he now reflects on something far more fragile. The moments that never happened. In the stillness of his ranch, he admits, "I've worked with the best, but I've also missed a few I wish I hadn't." The world knows Clint Eastwood, the legend, the gunslinger, the filmmaker, the stoic force of the West. But tonight, we meet Clint Eastwood, the dreamer, the man haunted not by mistakes, but by the collaborations that slipped through his fingers. 6 names linger in his memory. 6 artists he admired, respected, and quietly wished to share a frame with. These are not tales of fame or envy, but of regret, reverence, and the bittersweet truth that even legends carry unfulfilled dreams. As the sun fades over the hills of Carmel, Eastwood's voice, cracked with age and honesty, carries through time. Some people shape you without ever standing beside you. And so we begin. A journey through 6 ghosts of opportunity, 6 cinematic souls Clint Eastwood never worked with, but never forgot. Number 1. Billy Wilder. There was a time in the late 1960s when Clint Eastwood's career was just beginning to shift from a television cowboy to a serious film actor. Around the same time, Billy Wilder, the Austrian-born genius behind Sunset Boulevard, The Apartment, and Some Like It, Hot, was nearing the twilight of his career. 2 men from utterly different worlds, one built on silence and stoicism, the other on irony and wit. Yet Eastwood often confessed that he had a deep admiration for Wilder's ability to turn the flaws of human nature into cinematic poetry. In an interview from the early 1990s, Eastwood admitted Wilder understood people in a way that few directors ever did. He could make you laugh at tragedy and cry at comedy. That's a rare gift. For years, there were whispers in Hollywood that Wilder once considered casting Eastwood in a late-era project, a dark comedy about a washed-up detective in Los Angeles. But the timing never worked. Wilder was aging, the project lost its funding, and Eastwood was already steering toward directing Play Misty for Me. Still, Clint often said he wished they'd found a way to work together. Wilder represented a kind of filmmaking that fascinated him. The sharp dialogue, the emotional irony, the fragile balance between cynicism and compassion. Clint admired that Wilder could capture the heart of post-war America while never losing his sense of humor. In his memoir-style reflections, Eastwood once said quietly, "If I'd done a film with Billy, I think he would have forced me to show a side of myself I never did." He understood moral grayness better than anyone. As the years passed, Eastwood kept Wilder's films close, not just as classics, but as reminders of what might have been. 2 storytellers separated by time, both chasing truth through different shades of silence. Number 2. Howard Hawks. Before Clint Eastwood ever became the man with no name, he was a quiet observer, a student of those who had come before him. Among them, one name stood tallest: Howard Hawks. The director behind Rio Bravo, Red River, and His Girl Friday, Hawks was a man whose films defined the very masculinity and moral code that would later become Eastwood's cinematic identity. Though they never shared a set, Clint often spoke of Hawks with reverence, calling him the kind of filmmaker who didn't need to shout to make his point. In a 2004 interview with the Directors Guild of America, Eastwood reflected, "Howard Hawks had this way of making men human without stripping them of their strength. I owe a lot of my understanding of character to that." Hawks's quiet heroes, loyal friendships, and understated moral conflicts deeply influenced Eastwood's directorial style in films like Unforgiven and Gran Torino. There was once talk, during the late 1950s that Hawks might cast a young Eastwood in a supporting role for a war picture he was developing. But fate had other plans. The film was shelved, and Clint soon found himself drawn to Italy, a choice that would redefine him forever under Sergio Leone's gaze. Yet, he carried Hawks' lessons with him: restraint, simplicity, and the belief that a man's silence can speak louder than words. In later years, Clint often revisited Hawks's work, calling Rio Bravo one of the purest westerns ever made. He admired how Hawks portrayed camaraderie over chaos, decency over dramatics, values Eastwood would echo decades later. "If Hawks had directed me," Clint once mused, "he'd have made me talk a little more and feel a little less guilty about it." It was a quiet confession, one that revealed not just admiration, but a longing for mentorship that never came. Number 3. Raoul Walsh. In the grand sweep of Hollywood's golden age, few directors embodied adventure like Raoul Walsh. He was a man of roaring engines, galloping horses, and daring hearts, the kind of storyteller who made you believe life itself was a frontier. For Clint Eastwood, Walsh represented something primal, the wild instinct to chase stories before they became history. Eastwood grew up watching Walsh's films: High Sierra, 1941, White Heat, 1949, They Died with Their Boots On, and long before he wore a poncho or aimed a Colt, he studied Walsh's rhythm. In a 1995 conversation at the American Cinematheque, Clint recalled, "Raoul Walsh had this vitality in every frame. He made adventure look like destiny. You didn't watch his movies, you lived inside them." Though decades apart, their artistic spirits were uncannily similar. Both loved isolation, both distrusted authority, and both believed that men were defined not by victory, but by endurance. Walsh's rugged anti-heroes, men who rode into chaos with quiet defiance, were early blueprints for Eastwood's loners and lawmen. There was one particular film, A Distant Trumpet, 1964, that Clint once mentioned in passing as a farewell to an era. It was Walsh's final movie, and released the same year Clint broke out in A Fistful of Dollars, two generations of Western storytellers, unknowingly passing each other on the trail. "I wish I'd met him," Clint said, in a rare moment of nostalgia. "He had that restless soul I've always admired. The man just couldn't sit still." Walsh died in 1980, never knowing how deeply his vision had shaped the man who would carry the Western torch into a new century. For Eastwood, it was a connection that existed without words, a passing of cinematic fire from one restless outlaw to another. Number 4. John Ford. If there was one name Clint Eastwood spoke with both reverence and hesitation, it was John Ford. The towering figure of the Western genre, Ford was a man whose films carved American mythology into the big screen, from Stagecoach to The Searchers, to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance for Eastwood. Ford wasn't just a director. He was an unspoken father figure, a compass pointing toward what storytelling could mean when it came from the soul of a nation. In a 2012 interview, Clint confessed, "Ford didn't just shoot movies, he carved them out of dust and memory." He had met Ford only once, briefly, on a studio lot in the 1960s. Ford, then elderly and famously gruff, looked at Clint's tall frame and said simply, "Kid, learn where your horizon is." Eastwood never forgot it. Years later, he'd recall that single sentence as the best directing advice he'd ever received. Their lives were linked by the land, the American West as both stage and metaphor. Ford filmed it with poetry. Eastwood lived it with silence. Clint once said he would have given anything to work under Ford's direction, even for one scene, because Ford had the rare power to find humanity in the harshest deserts. When Eastwood directed the outlaw Josie Wales and later Unforgiven, critics noticed something different. a softer morality beneath the violence, a quiet homage to Ford's sense of place and pride. In interviews, Clint admitted that Unforgiven was as close as I could get to making a Ford movie my way. For Eastwood, John Ford represented the fatherly guidance he never truly had in life. Stern, unbending, but deeply moral. And though they never worked together, Clint's entire career became a conversation with Ford's ghost, a lifelong tribute to the man who defined the horizon he still looks toward. Number 5. Don Siegel. Of all the filmmakers Clint Eastwood ever crossed paths with, none shaped him more deeply than Don Siegel. Unlike the others, men he admired from afar, Siegel was the one who stood beside him, challenged him, and ultimately changed the course of his career. Their bond was both professional and personal, a friendship born out of mutual respect and quiet rebellion. They met in the late 1960s, a turbulent time in Hollywood. Eastwood had returned from his Italian success with Sergio Leone, searching for something that felt closer to home. Siegel, known for films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Killers, saw in Eastwood a face that could carry silence like a weapon. Their first major collaboration, Coogan's Bluff, 1968, was gritty, urban, and ahead of its time, and it marked the beginning of a creative partnership that would last more than a decade. Siegel was unlike anyone Clint had ever worked with. He didn't lecture, he provoked. "Don taught me that simplicity isn't weakness," Eastwood once said. He believed the audience was smarter than most directors gave them credit for. Together they crafted unforgettable works like The Beguiled, Two Mules for Sister Sarah, and Dirty Harry. It was on the set of Dirty Harry, 1971, that Siegel's mentorship became something more profound. Watching Siegel's quiet control over every detail, Clint realized he wanted to direct. "Don never said I should," he recalled, "but he showed me how." A year later, Clint stepped behind the camera for Play Misty for Me, dedicating it simply, "For Don Siegel." In later interviews, Eastwood described Siegel as the kind of friend who could insult you and teach you in the same breath. When Siegel passed in 1991, Clint called him the best collaborator I ever had, and the reason I ever became more than an actor. Number 6. Sergio Leone. Even though Clint Eastwood had already built his own legend by the time he looked back on his life, there was one name that always echoed with equal parts gratitude and ache: Sergio Leone, the Italian master who transformed a TV cowboy into an icon of global cinema. While Leone isn't on Eastwood's list of those he never worked with, he remains a haunting presence, the man who taught Clint how to live inside silence, and the one he later wished he'd reconciled with before it was too late. Their partnership began in the mid-1960s, when Leone cast the young American in A Fistful of Dollars. Clint was still relatively unknown, and Leone was reinventing the Western for a cynical new world. Together, they built something timeless. For a few dollars more, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Films that turned myth into realism, grit into art. But as the years passed, pride grew between them. Leone felt Eastwood owed his fame to his direction. Clint, in turn, believed he had outgrown the European shadow. In later interviews, Clint spoke of Leone with both affection and regret. "He was bigger than life," he said in a 2000 retrospective. "He saw things I didn't. Maybe we both were too stubborn to say what we really felt." When Leone died in 1989, Eastwood quietly attended a small memorial, standing at the back. No cameras, no speeches, just silence. In Unforgiven, Eastwood dedicated the film to Sergio and Don, two men who had shaped him in ways the world could never fully see. "I think about Sergio sometimes," Clint admitted softly. "We didn't part as friends, but I like to think we ended as something better, as pieces of the same story." Leone remains that whisper, a ghostly echo in the wind, reminding Eastwood that every masterpiece begins with a teacher you never quite thank enough. As the final light fades over Carmel Bay, Clint Eastwood sits in quiet reflection, not as the gunslinger nor the director, but as a man who has lived through 1,000 untold stories. The faces of Wilder, Hawks, Walsh, Ford, Siegel, and Leone move through his memory like flickering ghosts of silver and shadow. Men he never worked with, but who shaped his very soul. Each was a lesson, a lost chance, a reminder that even legends carry unfinished dreams. "Maybe that's the beauty of it," Clint once said softly. "You don't have to work with someone to be changed by them." And so we ask you, which story in your own life remains unfinished? Tell us in the comments below. If Clint's journey moved you, like, subscribe, and share to keep Hollywood's forgotten echoes alive.